Good morning and good afternoon, and welcome to this very important discussion. My name is Nadia McConnell. I'm a president and co-founder of the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation. General Breedlove, in talking about the hybrid war, uses the acronym DIME: diplomatic, information, military, and economic. We know on the information front that Moscow, the Kremlin, have used information for well over 100 years, if not centuries. I, for one, am a veteran on some of these, what I would call skirmishes regarding disinformation and propaganda. In the 60s, at the time when the whole initiative of captive nations was initiated by Dr. Lev Dobryansky, it was also a time when there was the effort to put in Washington the Tarashchenko monument. It had fierce opposition within certain circles, including the Washington Post. And fortunately, because of the strong bipartisanship in Congress, they were defeated. In the 80s, when I was director of congressional relations at FEMA, one of the programs that FEMA was responsible for had to do with nuclear safety. And of course, this was during the time of President Reagan's presidency. And so we saw, or I was very much aware of some of the disinformation and propaganda campaign that was directed in regards to the nuclear industry. And then in 88, I was director of the National Committee's Government Relations Committee in relations to the Millennium of Christianity of Kiev and Rus. And Mr. Gorbachev, Mr. Glasnost, tried to hijack that commemoration and insisted that the official commemoration take place not in Kiev, but in Moscow. And again, that was a skirmish that we fought hard, and perhaps story for another time. If we look at General Breedlove's description of what comprises the hybrid war, we can see that on the military side, that Putin is not doing as well as he expected and maybe others had expected. But I would contend that on the information war, he is succeeding very well. And because information ultimately influences our policies in regards to diplomacy, our military policies, economic policies, and because I think it is important that we understand the significance of this disinformation information war that is taking place and its critical significance. And so in this regard, we are very fortunate to have with us two experts who can talk about exactly how this works. First, we will have Sergio Germani, who is the scientific director of the Gino Germani Institute of Social Sciences and Strategic Studies. He's an expert on Russian domestic foreign policy with a special focus on hybrid warfare, strategies, organized crime, and Russian intelligence services. He also specializes in the study of intelligence and its role in protecting democratic states. If you look at his resume, I think you will see that he has been at the forefront to focus Italy on the significance of this ongoing disinformation campaign. He's written numerous articles and books, and we are going to focus on one of his three most recent researches today, and that is Disinformation and Active Measures, Pro-Kremlin Strategic Narratives in Italy on the War in Ukraine. I will also announce here that we will have some additional webinar discussions because his second research paper is focused on the narratives that are used in regard to in Italy on NATO, Western foreign and security policies, and nuclear war risks. Also joining us today is a dear friend and colleague, Dr. Donald Jensen, who is a senior advisor for the Center for Russia and Europe at the U.S. Institute of Peace, and an adjunct professor at the Krieger School of Arts and Sciences, Johns Hopkins University, a former U.S. diplomat, and has had numerous positions in government where identifying and understanding Soviet and Russian disinformation has been critical. One such position was Associate Director of Broadcasting, Head of Research Division at RFE-RL. And I'm happy to say he is also a member of the Foundation's Friends of Ukraine Network National Security Task Force. So let us begin, I think, Sergio, looking at your report. And by the way, we will have your report on our website. As I understand it, you have been a victim of some no longer available on your website, right? Your report is, first of all, very well easily understood by those of us who are not necessarily academics in research. And you really lay out all of the narratives. And frankly, I see it as a template that could be used in studying this issue wherever it occurs. So thank you for that. So without any further ado, I will turn to you to walk us through your report.
Yes, no, thank you very much. Think Tank in Rome has a website, but it's only available to people inside Italy. We've had to temporarily close it for outside access because there have been some cyber attacks, although we don't know if these are Russian or others or just simply routine attacks. But anyway, for those of you who want to read the report, we can send it or you could put it on your website.
We will. We will.
Yeah. So I just wanted to just briefly say about Russian pro-Kremlin narratives that regard the war in Ukraine, which are probably many of them are common to both to Italy and to other Western countries and to the US. You know, narratives like the Russian speakers in the Donbass have been the victims of genocide, that the Euromaidan revolution was a coup d'etat, a colored revolution sponsored by the CIA and by the US and other Western governments. That NATO has turned Ukraine into a bridgehead against Russia, that actually Ukraine is simply a tool of NATO and the US to destroy Russia. We have a lot of variants of this theme that which are repeated by a lot of Italian influencers, that the US actually wanted this war to take place, that it's in the benefit of the US because the goal of NATO and the US is to destroy Russia. So in this kind of reversal of reality, you have the war in Ukraine is interpreted not as an aggression, a military aggression, and even a genocidal aggression of Russia against Ukraine, but it's an aggression of the West against Russia. So reality is turned upside down. So I just wanted to mention, because all of these and other narratives are quite influential in Italy. It's difficult to quantify, but if you can access Italian television, you see a certain number of Italian influencers that go on television and repeat these narratives, right? University professors, former military people, former ambassadors, and they repeat these narratives. So I just to give it some historical perspective, I just want to say a few words about how Italy has become, why is Italy a major target of Russian propaganda, disinformation, and active measures. So because Italy is an important country, it's a pillar country of NATO and the European Union. It has a very important military role in the Mediterranean, and it's a key ally of the United States. At the same time, Moscow perceives Italy as being the weak link in NATO. So ever since the Cold War, they have been trying they have targeted Russian, Soviet active measures have targeted Italy in order to influence and destabilize it. So it's very important to understand the concept of Soviet active measures, because what we're seeing today is a kind of a re-edition of what we had in the Cold War. So active measures, and most people, I think, know the concept of active measures. Активные мероприятия. It's a Soviet term that means embraced various techniques of political and psychological influence and destabilization. So everything from disinformation to propaganda, recruitment of agents of influence, financing of parties, of opposition parties. At that time, it was the Communist Party in Italy that they financed, and which was a very important instrument of Soviet influence. Support also for terrorism, extreme movements, and at that time they supported left-wing terrorism in Italy and other countries in order to destabilize Western Europe. So there were all of these techniques. Now, all of these active measures techniques were resurrected and modernized by Putin after Putin came to power around 2004, 2005, when there was a shift toward a more aggressive foreign policy, a neo-imperial foreign policy in Moscow. So they resurrected and modernized with 21st century technologies all of these active measures. Now, until 2012, I would say 2012, the Kremlin's active measures in Italy were mostly aimed at influencing and co-opting the Italian establishment, at influencing the perceptions of the Italian elite, the political elite, the economic elite, this idea that Russia was an opportunity and not a threat, that there had to be close cooperation with Russia in all fields. This was the idea. And also co-opting the elite through corruption and through business relationships. So one example is Berlusconi, who was a close friend of Putin, and probably some people say that they have had some business interests. So until 2012, you had this strategy. After 2012, the strategy kind of shifted, because the Kremlin shifted to what Donald Jensen, in a very important paper, it was called the strategy of chaos, which meant that the Kremlin no longer just wanted to influence the West, but they wanted to provoke destabilization in the West, to deepen divisions, to deepen instability, and so on. So what did that mean in Italy? It meant that on the one side, they continued to cultivate the elite and the establishment, right? They didn't abandon that strategy, but on the other hand, they supported these new anti-establishment movements, the populist movements, the nationalist populist movements, the revolt, the kind of populist revolt that was growing all over Europe because of the economic crisis. So they supported that because they saw that the Kremlin saw this as being strategically useful to weaken the EU, to weaken NATO, and to create instability in general. So this is still their strategy today, to support these kind of anti-establishment movements. And some analysts say that they're actually maybe interested in supporting the even more extreme movements and even terrorist movements in Europe, but I don't know if there is evidence of that. But it's consistent with the Soviet approach, right? To even use violent groups in order to, when they supported populist revolt in Italy, they used different kinds of narratives that are being used today. The narrative, for example, that Italy has no sovereignty because the EU and NATO have canceled. Italy is not a sovereign country. It's the slave of the United States, of NATO, and of the EU. Then all kinds of narratives about migration, that actually mass migration is a kind of invasion that poses an existential threat, and it's being managed by elites like Soros, or by the CIA, or by other actors. And then also the elites, different kinds of narratives about Ukraine, that Euromaidan was a coup d'etat supported by the US and NATO. that the primary goal of U.S. foreign policy is to divide Europe from Russia, because according to this narrative, Washington is afraid that Europe and Russia could get together and form a kind of big Eurasian bloc that would be a competitor to the United States. So the Ukraine war is actually a deliberate policy of Washington in order to divide Europe from the US. This is one of the narratives. But there are all kinds of narratives. Of course, the narrative that they've been spreading for many years is that Russia is a force for stability in the world. It's not a destabilizing factor in the international affairs, but it's a force for stability and security. And actually, it's the US that destabilizes the world order. It's the US that is pushing the world toward nuclear war, right? Also the narratives about nuclear war are quite important, and they echo the narratives that you had during the Cold War, because during the Cold War, all efforts, for example, Reagan's rebuilding of the nuclear arsenal in order to keep parity with was depicted by Soviet propaganda as a way of pushing the world toward nuclear war. So if you opposed Soviet expansionism at that time, you were someone who was bringing the world closer to nuclear war. And it's a similar narrative today in Italy, because you have these pro-Russian influencers that say that if the West supports Ukraine, if it arms Ukraine, and so on, it's pushing the world, Europe especially, toward nuclear war. So it should not do that. It should leave Ukraine to its own fate, right? This is the idea, which actually echoes the nuclear kind of propaganda that they had in Soviet times. And also, there's another narrative about the multipolar world. This is another Soviet narrative, a Russian narrative, that the world is going toward multipolarity. It's no longer a world dominated by the US and by the West, but there are also other centers of world power, like China, Russia, Islam, Latin America, and so on. And that the Ukraine war is not an aggression of Russia against Ukraine. It's a way of the West, of the US, to stop this evolution toward the multipolar world, right? If you support Ukraine, you are trying to block the evolution of the world toward multipolarity, right? And instead, Russia is fighting in the Ukraine for multipolarity. So again, you have a kind of a reversal of reality, right? So this is the kind of, perhaps I should stop now and we can discuss some of these points.
Yes, yeah. Well, thank you so much. So Don, to my untrained eye, I guess, or not a true researcher, I said that I thought Sergio's research paper could be a template. But of course, you have reminded me, yes, but there are certainly differences, right? And I guess we do understand that the Russian disinformation is tailored, right, to whatever country it's being engaged. But I think also, and I guess this is what your paper has pointed out. I see that the narratives or playbook has certain continuing themes that go back for over 100 years. But as technology has given them additional opportunities, they refine, right, the actual mechanics of implementing these different narratives. So, Don, if you would talk about what is happening here in the United States.
First of all, I highly recommend to the audience reading these several papers. I'm very happy to say that we're going to have a series on these discussions. But I guess my fundamental point would be, and I hate to disagree with my friend Phil Greenlow, I want to add questions. This is about multi-dimensional Russian warfare, some of which is kinetic, as I said, some of which is non-kinetic. And I would add a bunch of C's to what you described, Nadia. There's also crime, corruption, culture, history, and religion are all part of this competition that Russia is engaging with in the West, and also have direct applicability to Ukraine. And it's very important. And I, again, in my hat as a professor, I get a lot of students who want to write about Russian disinformation. And that probably is the cutting edge weapon. But this is multidimensional. And we have to see what's going on and what the Institute's terrific report says is the multidimensionality of it. Because as we've said, there's a lot of continuity with the past. The KGB did this 50 years ago, it did it 30 years ago, and so forth. But there are some differences, which Nadia, you mentioned. One of which is the high technology issue, social media in particular, which you can now reach all sorts of audiences in a cheap way through trolls and other things by sending this nonsense out there. And that's something that is much more difficult when you're listening to Voice of Moscow from an African country, let's say in 1980. So it's much easier to get out there. It's high tech. The second point I would make, which you both alluded to, which is that this is part of a toughening Russian worldview that started under Putin, that continues today. And Sergio nicely mentioned the elements of it. Russia is a victim of the U.S. imperialism. The world is sliding into multipolarity. The 90s were an attempt by the U.S. to weaken Russia, NATO expansion, and you can go right on down the line. This stuff that goes out is sometimes contradictory. They like to create chaos, as Sergio said, but it's a much more coherent worldview shared by much of the top Russian elites. And you see this almost every day. The head of the Secretary of the Security Council, Mr. General, whatever he is, talks about the West in a almost hysterical, paranoid way. And one can always ask whether we believe in that or not. I think that they do. And this is very much more coherent since Putin has expelled much of the more moderate forces in the government, raising the question of whether this will continue after Putin or not, or in some other variant. Now, I see the narratives themselves. Sergio hit, I think, most of the main points. Italy is an excellent example to study because Italy has some key issues which are grievances against, say, Brussels or grievances against some of its partners. And so Russia tailors that menu of weapons to deal with what it perceives as Italy's vulnerability. The same goes for France, where they finance some of the far-right populist parties. The same goes for Germany, Estonia, and so forth. It's never exactly the same all the time. And even in the aftermath of the Wagner disaster, we see Russia's narratives playing on the colonial grievances of African countries. So they will not see this as a Russian thing so much as a Russian justifiable playing up, emphasizing their grievances, which of course do exist, about the colonial period. Now, as for the U.S. and its allies, the UK, they tailor their messaging very much for the U.S. and British and particular themes. They're very conscious of think tank activity in the West. They're very conscious of the public debate about the war in the West, including the United States. And they can, as Sergio said, and as the report states, they spin narratives in a way that have some receptivity in certain Western audiences. And this is not to say, by any means, that the people who are in the West who often make very cogent arguments on their positions, it's not to say that they're witting or indirect tools of Moscow. It's to say that in a world dominated by communication and social media, putting ideas out there that cause uncertainty, that cause doubt, whether it's about Ukraine winning or something else, these can be very, very powerful. And as I said, as Sergio said, the chaos creation for strategic advantage is now a much more frequently used item of the playbook Nadia mentioned than it has been in the past. Excuse me. Take the nuclear issue, which I'm glad Sergio mentioned. There are people such as former President Medvedev who talk about using nukes all the time. There are other people, General most recently in the past few days, who talk about maybe we should drop a tactical nuke on Ukraine or Poland. Now, those are in large part, in my view, public disinformation themes to undermine Western support for the war and to limit its support. But there are people in the Kremlin who seem less well-known figures who seem to favor that kind of thing. So this uncertainty about what Russia will do, whether it will escalate, is a deterrent, in my view, to some of the Western measures that could be taken, and that creates a low-cost advantage for Russia. I want to say a couple things to wrap up, and we can go to questions. First of all, the question of what to do, how to respond, is central to all of this. The U.S. government some years ago created something called the Global Engagement Center. There are mixed views about its performance. I have no strong views, since a lot of my friends work there. But sending out truthful narratives is important, but I don't think it's by any means the only thing we can do. Right? As you might notice, in the run-up to the war, the American government, led by the CIA head Bill Burns, selectively released declassified information to engage the world public opinion about whether the weapon would attack and so forth. And I think that was a very creative and I think welcome use of government information. As always is the case, or often the case lately, I think we need to praise the Ukrainians for their resilience. I think they have kind of spun back their own information operations into Russia. And I think with some effect, just as we've seen the Ukrainians mastermind, or coincidental, let's say mastermind, attacks on oil facilities in Crimea and in Western Russia, I think the Ukrainians will also have been very clever at pushing back at Russia in new ways and at low prices. The real one of the questions on the table, a big one, is to say, what will happen in the future? Will Russia continue this? Will it step it up? And I think even if Russia loses the war, and I think it will, Russia will still have these global aspirations to being a great power that Putin so ardently encourages in the population. And what we're likely to see, and to some extent we're seeing already, is a reset, not I'll call it a reset, make you laugh, a reset of some of the tools that they use. The Wagner off is very interesting. Certainly, the Kremlin wants to keep control of those resources. But I expect disinformation, high-tech disinformation in particular, as it adapts to the new environment, may actually be stepped up. It's a cheap alternative to military operations. There are long audiences, especially in Africa and South Asia, for this kind of thing, unfortunately. And but the Ukrainians, among others, I think have done a good job, partly by taking it to the Russians. They're not afraid, they're not shy about pressuring Moscow, about pressuring, challenging the more crazy Russian narrative. So it's a very much an inflection point, as they say, of where this will go. But I expect that Russia will intensify this kind of hybrid non-month activity in the years ahead, as it takes an economic hit from the sanctions and the war. Thank you. We'll look forward to any questions you might have.
Well, okay, so before you can propose solutions to any problem, I think you have to have a clear understanding of what the problem is. And from where I sit, I think one of the concerns I have is that we in the West have failed consistently to really understand the scope and depth of this ongoing disinformation propaganda that has been going on. We relaxed during détente, and yet we've heard that during détente, that was when the Soviets would expand their spy network because everybody was relaxed. So this is so how do we and I think this is why I think Sergio's efforts in trying to get Italy to understand that this is a major component of what they are dealing with. I think that we talk about this here, but I don't think there's a systematic, if I would say, understanding or approach. Am I wrong about that? Yes.
Yeah, I think you're correct, Mark. There's not an understanding, partly because our worldviews are so different, and we tend to see war or peace as pretty much a black and white thing. We see the issue of information operations, as I mentioned earlier, in isolation without seeing this as part of a broader Russian assault on the West and the Chinese too. And then I would argue, this is my personal view, that we as Americans are not particularly good at seeing, as you said, Russian history, experience, behavior. We tend, like a lot of countries, we mirror image our own history. I have a good friend who you know, Nadia, who used to say, the problem with Americans view of the world, I don't endorse it, but I cite it clearly in my classes because it's very illustrative. The problems with Americans is that we think that for every problem there is a solution. Then number two would be that we think that history doesn't matter. And then number three would be that culture doesn't matter. And number four, I would add, would be that we tend to think that if there's no solution, there must be no problem. For my own view, and again, as an academic sometimes academic, I think this is an argument in favor of kind of a more integrated, less political sciencey view of our competitors that incorporates history, government, culture, and all those things. I don't think we have a very good understanding of Russia even now. And the best example I would cite, Nadia, is the almost complete ignorance in most circles of Ukraine and its very rich and unique culture and history. Leading up to 2014 tragic adventure by Moscow. You could argue that if we understood at the time better, and I would put myself in this group of ignorance, that Ukraine is a unique society with its own language, we might not have been so receptive to Russian disinformation about fascist control, ethnocentrism, anti-Semitism. So this issue you raised, Nadia, is very important, that we understand these societies much better. I think we all need to improve on that.
Well, before I ask Sergio whether or not his work he feels has made a difference that he's seeing in Italy, but getting to just not understanding, I'm just always not amused at all that we don't seem to understand the whole scope, and that sometimes they employ the most crude and obvious tactics. For instance, the announcement that there are going to be new textbooks, right, to be used, which completely are falsifying history. And we tend to sort of almost maybe laugh it off a little bit and not really take it as seriously when you put it in context of everything else that is being gone. So Sergio, tell me, do you think that you have made some progress in getting Italy, your citizenry and your governments to address this or understand this a little bit better?
Well, it's difficult to say because I think Russian influence is very strong in Italy, and it's strong also in what you would call the deep state. Even in I think that there are strong pro-Russian or Russian, what we call Russian understanders, not people that are actually pro-Putin, but that they understand Russian. They understand why Putin is aggressive. I mean, they kind of relativize this. They say it's the fault of NATO. It's the fault of the West that never understood Russia properly. They did not integrate Russia after the Cold War. They tried to humiliate Russia. So in the end, you can understand why the Russians have acted so aggressively. So this is what you would call Russian understanders. And this kind of way of thinking is very widespread also in the foreign policy community, in the national security community, in the military. So they're not people that would be against NATO, but they're people who would kind of understand. So it's difficult to make a difference right now. I think we've made progress, because a few years ago you couldn't even talk about this subject. Now there's a lot of interest in the academic community and public community. There is interest in this, and you can talk about it openly, and also the government itself talks about it. But I think there are limits to what you can do, because you have a lot of very strong economic and political centers of power that are kind of Russia understanders, right? Then also another thing I wanted to think, I agree with Don that says that when he says that disinformation is just one component of a multidimensional strategy to attack Western democracies, which is not just disinformation, it's also cyber attacks, it's also support for anti-system and extremist movements, it's corruption and use of corruption in order to weaken Western societies and to co-opt them, right? This is a very important aspect which it's not deeply studied yet. And in Italy, it's quite important, because Italy is a place where the major oligarchs, pro-Kremlin oligarchs, have a lot of interest. They have not only villas, they bought the most beautiful villas in Sardinia, in Tuscany, and so on. But they have been exerting through money influence. Right? So this is a very important part of Russian influence in Italy, or also in other countries in Europe, which is part of the hybrid, this multidimensional hybrid strategy you have to study. So I don't think you can only concentrate on disinformation, but you should look also about all of these other aspects, including also the use of organized crime networks, which may be becoming more important now, and also the use of Russian intelligence services. This is quite important because they've suffered a lot of blows recently. A lot of their people have been kicked out. But my question is, I'm not sure, but they are still quite a formidable force, because they have so-called illegals. For example, there was a recent case which involved both Italy and the United States, which is the case of Natalia Burlikova, who's the head of a Kremlin-linked think tank, the Creative Diplomacy, that had a program going on in the United States, and there's an FBI affidavit about her. Right? She's in Russia now, but the FBI wants to arrest her. Now, we found out that she has had a lot of activities in Italy too, doing the same kind of thing. So what was this program? Apparently, it was a kind of legitimate soft power program, which you would bring young leaders from the US and from other European countries, take them to Russia, to Moscow, for a 3 or 4 day visit, for events, visits, and so on. So it was a kind of legitimate soft power thing. But really, that program, according to the FBI, was financed by the FSB, was secretly at least co-financed by the FSB. And this lady actually referred to the FSB. The FBI intercepted her communications with an FSB officer. So her task was identifying young leaders in the West and taking them to Russia, where the FSB could study them, to profile them, to see which could be recruited. Because this is the kind of long-term long-term approach that they have that in the West we don't have. They have a long-term intelligence approach where they try to cultivate young people that will become future leaders. So when they become future leaders, they will be pro-Russian, or they may be Russian agents of influence or Russian intelligence assets, right? So they have this kind of long-term view that recently, I think, a U.S. intelligence community report has analyzed this. And one of the examples is this lady that was active both in the United States and in Italy. However, in Italy, this thing did not arouse much interest, really. It was in the papers 1 or 2 days, and then it disappeared. So there's a lot to do here, because there is not enough awareness of the threat.
If I could add, go ahead.
Yes, go ahead, Don.
Yeah, I very much agree with what Sergio said, and I want to add some, I guess, important nuances or details. If someone in Italy agrees with a Russian position on something, on an issue like NATO expansion, whatever, it doesn't mean that that person is under the payment of Russia or a Russian agent. You hear the concept, hear the concept of useful idiots a lot, but you don't even, that's even too strong in some cases. What matters to Russia is getting its chaos, its other alternative ideas out there, and that can be done through people who are very innocent, sincere, well-meaning, who are not aware of the bigger dynamic. The Russians have a phrase called reflexive control, which is they want to get people to do what they want without necessarily pushing them, but getting them to end up in a place that benefits the Kremlin. I'll give you an example, which is to say that Italy's tensions with Brussels, the European Union, are pretty well known, and Italy's just complaints about who pays for the migration crisis and that kind of thing are well known. So if Russia can do things that increases Italy's frustration with the European Union, that serves Kremlin interests in an indirect way. And so they triangulate some of these positions to get the maximum result for what they see as a country that targets vulnerabilities. And that does not mean that the people involved in building Austria, Brussels, Belgium, stooges. It just means that the Kremlin is very good at reading some of these complicated dynamics in these societies and tries as best it can to take advantage of them.
So, Don, I see that we probably have on the docket perhaps another discussion. I absolutely accept your correction to my citing General Breedlove.
I don't correct.
Well, because, Sergio also mentioned, the reluctance to even admit some of this was going on. And, one of the ways I have understood Russian influence, let's say in the United States, is that they had captivated the world of academia. They were the ones that were teaching, right, Russian history and also the cultural sphere, right, the whole, the ballet, the Fabergé eggs, and so that was also an area of, segments of our society that they have been working for decades.
Very much so. Very much so.
So I think that's yes. So I think it just was it last year that there's been an announcement that the world of academia is having to sort of rethink how they have been doing Soviet studies, right?
Yeah.
So there's that, sort of perhaps now there's some recognition, because some of us, every time we would talk about some things, looked like we were just, paranoid, seeing things.
I have one more point to make, Nadia, before we go to questions, if I might.
Okay.
Which is to say, this stuff doesn't always go right in the way that Kremlin wants it. And I think one can make a strong case that it's gone very wrong in some dimensions of their attempt to publicize their aggression and spin it in the way that they want. And I think we need to have more discussion about when does it not work? When do they get it wrong? Because they do get it wrong sometimes. And
absolutely.
And I think that this is again a testimony to Ukrainians' resilience and creativity. That one of the reasons they get it wrong is Ukrainians have showed the paradigm to be mistaken and faultless and flawed.
So, okay. So because we promised that we would get to questions, let's see. Gary likes, if I pronounce it correctly, he says, I've been to Ukraine probably 30 times, and he went to Russia on a federal government trade mission in 98 and got to meet Putin. I am just a Canadian guy. Why is it that politicians are so stupid and don't understand what Putin has been saying for over 20 years? I didn't screen this question. Why are they so ignorant?
That must be for Sergio.
Yeah. Well, it depends on which politicians. I mean, for until the first aggression against Ukraine, there was an idea that the policy of a lot of European states was the kind of policy of strategic partnership with Russia, right? So only the Baltics and Poland were warning against that approach. So the idea was that, yes, Putin is an authoritarian, Russia is undemocratic, and so on. But if we cooperate with them, especially in economics, in business, they will become they will be tied into a kind of web of interdependence with the West, and they will gradually democratize. This was the idea, but it was wrong. It was basically a wrong idea that had to be abandoned. I think now a lot of the politicians understand the Putin threat better, but I don't know. In Italy, still, I would say most maybe understand, but there's a reluctance to admit, because the main idea in the past 20 years was that Putin's Russia was an opportunity and in no way a threat. The threats came from the south, from illegal immigration, from Islamic terrorism, and so on, but not from the east, not from Russia. And there was a kind of understanding that Russia needs to have its own sphere of influence, this was the idea, and it's still, this kind of mindset still is very much alive here in this country, and maybe also in other European countries. So I think it was probably ever since Putin came to power, but even before, because I remember that Donald, even in Yeltsin's time, was warning that we couldn't take for granted a benign Russia forever, right? Even in the 1990s. But there was a kind of reluctance after the end of the Cold War there was a lack of expertise. A lot of the Soviet experts were not replaced. So I think all over the world, perhaps even in the United States, there was a lack of expertise on Russia and also on the Soviet Union.
Many times I heard American businessmen talk about investment being a force, as you say, so for better relations, and ultimately they would join the, whatever you want to call it, capitalist West, and it just didn't work. It didn't work at all, and there's still some Western companies there, of course. That was one of the main reasons we thought we were going to make them more benign. It just didn't work.
Yeah, but there's still very strong. Yeah.
But I think, Don, you're saying that sometimes it doesn't always work because I think it tends sometimes to backfire. And I think Putin's war in Ukraine, I think, is maybe we're seeing some cracks in some of these stereotype thinking, ingrained thinking, right? Question from Tamara Denisenko: how extensive is the Russian propaganda network still in Ukraine today? Do you have any sense?
That I do not know. You would know Navi more than anybody, I think. Well,
I think perhaps this is again another topic. I mean, we are aware and have been aware since very active. You want to say Russian agents, certainly during President Yanukovych's period, right? There was that was so obvious. But perhaps we'll have to get somebody from Ukraine to deal with this. Now, Alex Z has had numerous. Go ahead.
Okay, given the poll rating with Zelensky and support for the resistance, which is quite high, I would expect not very influential, but certainly in Donbass, before the war, there was significant but not majority support for Russia, and I don't know where that is right now. You can't take polls of what's going on there.
So Alex has several questions. I'll just try to get at a couple of them. One has to do, I guess, with news coverage, and why has Romania evaded admitting that Russian drones have fallen onto NATO soil recently? And then believe that in their multipolar world quest, that the Kremlin actions are truly at the behest of neutral China. I suspect that Russia's is China's inroad into Europe. Would you agree?
I can take China, which is to say, I think that relationship is extremely hard to track, and I would say I would disagree with what you say in the question, which is that one is not a stalking horse for the other, but they work. I won't say closely; they are partners. But I think it's been very interesting to see China offer its own peace plan, trying to take a greater global economic role in the world, including in terms of getting some kind of negotiations going. However, I don't for a minute doubt that China doesn't oppose NATO, want to undermine U.S. influence in the world, and all the other things that we've seen, including brokering with the Russians a statement of the G20 over the weekend, which I thought was a product of both countries. So there is, I think, some daylight between them. I think there's some nervousness on both sides about what's going on, and certainly the trajectory is to become closer. But I would not say one is a stalking horse for the other.
With just a few minutes left, do you want to say a few words about really what do you think going forward should we be doing? Sergio, do you want to talk about what you think should be done in Italy? Or
I think the government should take more seriously the issue of Russian hybrid operations and intelligence operations in Italy, much more seriously than it's taken so far. We've had a recent case here of a pro-Russian propagandist, a lady, Italian-Russian lady, a Russian but with also Italian citizenship, that is now being hired at the Senate. So this is, in another country, would be a real scandal, because you should have some kind of security clearance to get into a job like that. So I think Italy should do much more at the government level. First of all, at the government level, and also at the level of civil society. There should be more awareness of the threat of foreign hostile influence, not only from Russia, but also from China, also from Iran, and from other autocratic states. It's not just an issue. Actually, China is much more subtle and more effective in the long term than Russia. They are winning a great deal of influence in the Italian media system and the university system. They have a much more subtle long-term approach than Russia. So China is a real threat. And to some extent, they may cooperate. To get back to the question of one of the gentlemen, there is some degree of cooperation in influence activities. So I think there should be much more awareness in public opinion of this kind of threat. But unfortunately, I don't see right now the government doing much about it. The government is staunchly Atlanticist. It supports Ukraine. At least the Ms. Meloni is doing that, the prime minister. But about doing something about hybrid influence, disinformation, other forms of influence and interference. Now we have the European elections coming up. I don't think the government is doing what it should do. I think it should do much more. But it's difficult for Mrs. Meloni because some of the people in her own government coalition have a history of ties with Moscow, like Mr. Salvini, for example, who is a minister. So I think there should be more pressure from the US and more involvement of the US and NATO. US as the key ally, I think should be more active in pushing Italy toward a more active approach on these issues. My impression is that there's not enough kind of in US and other Western involvement in kind of helping Italy to adopt a clearer position and strategy against hostile foreign influence, both Russian and Chinese, right? This is. I think there should be more U.S. Involvement in this.
So, Don, Sergio is suggesting that U.S. has some leader before we can play a leadership role. We have to make sure that we ourselves are fully cognizant and dealing with the problem.
I think we are, and I'm not sure that we fully, as we said many times this hour, fully cognizant of the problem. We need to respond more quickly, more effectively, and realize the nature of the threat, we being the West included. I think, as I said earlier, there's much to learn from what the Ukrainians have been doing so cleverly. There's much to learn from what the Poles and above all the Baltic republics have done in countering disinformation. And I think there's lessons to be learned there. And I would be lessons to be learned there that I think we have insufficient, believing the rest of the West have insufficiently looked at, because it's not necessarily going to be a problem financed by a big government agency, whatever that might be. But awareness is the key. And I think, again, as you said, Nadia, as we've all said in this hour, we're not, I think, still, after all that's happened, sufficiently aware of what has been going on beneath our noses. Again, to end on a predictive note, I do think this will be continued, probably in new forms and probably at a greater, more frenetic level by Moscow and cyber, artificial intelligence. All these things present new challenges to combating disinformation. And that's quite a road ahead we have to deal with. And I'm not necessarily really optimistic, but hopeful, I guess is what I would say.
So, well, thank you very much. I guess I have about maybe 30 seconds to go. So, Sergio, we talked about that the next session we will devote to your paper dealing with how narratives are being used in regard to the issue of NATO, right? And perhaps in that session, maybe we can include some of your colleagues, Lithuania, where they just recently had, right, the summit, the NATO summit, and what they're seeing. And so we can see, maybe address it on even more global way than we have today. Thank you so very, very much. I think this is a discussion that bears much more time, and we will find creative ways to continue this. Sergio, thank you very much for this incredible piece of work that you've done. It will be on our website and to read it. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Until the next time, do pobaczenia.
Thank you.
Thank you.